Hey, greetings. My name is Alexander von Beber, and I um, am making a premiere video to talk about some of the things that are important to me in my practice with runes. I've been meaning to make a video for a long time, and I actually attended a sumble. As a lot of people know, there are you usually brag or swear an oath, and I did a little bit of both. And I swore that I would make a video about the runes. Um, and it's a really intimidating subject because there's just so much. I have a lot of information to share, but even as I go over the information in my head, there are still so many uncertainties. There's so much. There's so much about the source materials that you can always sort of double back down and second guess. And I think this is the nature of subjects that are highly metaphorical, because we are, at the end of the day, left hanging on to little threads that of insinuation, and that's sort of the way the mysteries are communicated in the source materials. So what are the runic source materials? Well, there are rune stones, which range in age, and there are characteristics of these rune stones that can tell you and help you date the content, just based on the inscriptions usually, but also there are archaeological methods as well. Then there are the rune poems, and these are all basically medieval. The oldest of them are from around the 9th century in England, which is Christianized at this time. But then there are later ones that pop up in Scandinavia with Christianization. So these are probably the most significant source materials, because these are used to, along with correlations with the Gothic alphabet and various other things, to help us define, name, categorize the runes, as well as they give descriptive associations with the runes in poetic verse. There are literary sources, and the literary sources probably have an oral tradition. And these we find in like the Poetic Edda predominantly, right? And then we get a commentary on that oral tradition from the Prose Edda. So these are two mythological source materials, but people don't often realize that they're also prime witnesses for the runes. They have a lot to say about the runes. Oh, at least the Poetic Edda does. The Prose Edda conspicuously shies away from the subject, and doesn't really touch on it almost at all. So, however, the Prose Edda is not irrelevant to the subject, because the Prose Edda is an excellent witness to skaldic language, which you'll find in the Skaldskaparmal portion published under the Prose Edda, but oftentimes not published in its entirety in English, and that's a great disservice to English readers. So yeah, the skaldic language becomes relevant to the runes, but that particular text is not instructive on the connection between the skaldic language and the runes. Whereas with the Poetic Edda, we get pretty raw examples of Old Norse poetry, and they have various layers of historicity to them, right? Like some of them are clearly using archaic language that we only find in the earliest rune stones, and we find examples of that in the Havamal. In the Havamal's 79th or 80th verse, there is a word that appears that only ever appears in inscriptions, and nowhere else appears in the Poetic Edda. It is then proven what you with runes ask, invoked are the gods, made by the Genragen, colored by Fimbulthulr, then he has him best if he is silent. However, the phrase invoked are the gods utilizes an archaic term, regen kunum, which means literally judges, and then the word kunum, it's a compound word. Kunum means to know, to do, or to basically to invoke, and so it's here translated as invoked. This phrase comes up in association with the runes um, in some pretty archaic contexts. The oldest example of the word regen kunum is probably on the Noleby Rune Stone, which uses the phrase Ragina Kundo, which is a sort of a Proto-Norse equivalent. The Noleby Rune Stone utilizes Elder Futhark, and it's basically a 6th century inscription. So that's in about the middle range of Elder Futhark inscriptions. The inscription itself says, "Runes painted, the gods descended." The words "gods" descended being Ragina Kundo. I offer for your approval. And then the final words are actually sort of either cultic or a personal name. Suhura Suse Wets Hakutho. The word wets is hueten, and that's, of course, these are all theoretical interpretations. The only phrase that's very clear in this inscription in terms of its uncontested would be runo fahi, which is runes painted, and then ragina kundo, which we have in the Havamal attested. The Havamal is not the only place where the word ragina kundo comes up. Ragina kundo appears in a later inscription, actually. So, basically, in the 8th century, so, a couple hundred years, you get an inscription called the Sparlosa runestone from Västergötland. And that runestone more or less says that Sigmar named his son Eirix. There was a mighty battle of some sort, and the stone was raised in memory of Eivissel. And then it says, End, Roth, red were the runes, and the gods descended, Ragina Kundo, that Alrikar Lubu colored. Again, that word Fathi. These two inscriptions have in common with the Havamal verse a preoccupation with the ritual procedure of the carving or, in their own words, asking of runes. So the Sparlosa stone in particular says that the runes were asked and then the Genregen were invoked. Whereas here in the Havamal, it says that what you with runes ask invoked are the gods. And then it gives you the ritual procedure of it is best to be silent. This type of divine inquiry, as it appears, is also here said to be presided over by Fimbulthulr. And this is a consistent element that we will find in later references to the runes, that Fimbulthulr is a name of Odin that gets applied to a very specific context. So, language is one of the many ways that we have to determine the sort of the age and authenticity of interpolations, because we find examples of this, which are sort of attested procedure and attested nomenclature. Another aspect of the poetry that gives it a sort of a complex fingerprint is its use of meter. And then there's predominantly like 2 or 3 meters that you'll see, or 4, I guess. You'll see speech meter, You'll see Fornirdislag, which is the ancient poetic law, which is kind of the basic meter. And then you'll see Ilodahatar, which is for song speech, which is it's basically the rudiments of the religious or magical song meter. And then you'll see Galdrolog, which is explicitly a variation of that meter for sorcery. And then you'll see some prose interludes. So it's this very rigid formula in many places that preserves the poetic formula sort of preserves some older aspects of it, because the poetry has a sound that would have been identifiable to multiple generations of Old Norse speakers. The text itself is considered 13th century, like in the manuscript, and that's sort of like a middle ground date, correlating like the age of the actual paper, or between the age of the actual paper and Snorri Sturluson, who was a little older than that, who wrote the prose Edda in his like functional operational time. Those two texts would have had a mutual sources, and they share enough that we know that at least until the time of their mutual source, there is a sort of a continuity in some of the verses as quoted by Snorri. There's no major variations in Snorri's quotations, I don't believe, from examples of those texts and other documents. So, and then anyway, all these books, they were compiled in Iceland. And that represents not a unique manifestation of strictly Icelandic lore. There is a sort of a narrative, geographical motion that happens in the text, where you deal with the stories of the gods, and then you're dealing with the stories of the heroes, but particularly like the Volsung line, and then the Volsung line tends to inhabit Burgundia, and they live on the continent of Europe, whereas then when you get into the later text, as the Volsungs go into diaspora, they end up in Norway and ultimately Iceland. So that is sort of the narrative locations of things. As a result, Snorri interpreted this as being a migration story, but he gives it sort of over to an early conception, I guess, of the Indo-European migration. He says that the divine portions, the Aesir, are inhabitants of Asia, and that the subsequent people sort of just migrate from Asia. And he gives it a sort of a pseudo-historical narrative where the mythological beings are ancient kings. But it shows that there is, I think there is some cosmology to the presentation and the order of text in the manuscript. Even though the text itself has a very eclectic compilation of verses and interpolations. And I say that because when you look at a single poem, it'll have interpolations from other poems, insertions of other meters, but these sections will also be sort of self-contained points. And I think these points confuse people, especially in the Havamal, because in the Havamal, you have the Gestathata, which is sort of very, very easy for people to wrap their heads around. Although I think there's more to it than just the axioms, of don't do this, don't do that. But it looks like a simple code of conduct or code of wit. Whereas when you get to the next sections, things get more obscure, and they even begin to talk about runes, and then go on to talk about things you can't trust, including some misogynistic comments. But with that whole section is very cryptic, and they even talk about runes just before they talk about that section. And so, to me, this is where when you run into a cryptic section of text like that, you're sort of running headlong into, in my opinion, some kind of mystical content that has not been interpreted properly in modern times. So that's something that throughout the course of my videos, I'm going to unpack and talk about very specific symbolism that is of a very specific date in the runes. So yeah, and I feel like until I get into that material, I haven't satisfied my oath of symbol. Now, when we continue in the Havamal, next we have the Lodfafnismal. Lodfafnismal is really cryptic. We're in the same text under our chapter heading in our book, but we're looking at a different text or a different segment of text within the skaldic corpus. It's not the same as the Havamal. In fact, I would wager the Gestathottir is a Havamal. Probably was appended to another poem originally. The Domi Odins, or the weird stuff about women, probably still a part of the Gestathottir, and then some of that runic reference is probably something along that line. Although the Domi Odins is characteristic of using later language than any other text in the Havamal, so it's a newer contribution. And then there you have the Lodfafnismal, which is all about this character Lodfafnir having a dialogue. And I'm going to add that this dialogue is maybe some of the most important theological material in the entire book. But there are elements of it that are so outside the scope of modern religions that I think we take it for granted. So I'm going to maybe talk about why that's important today. So beyond that, then you have the Runetal, which the Runetal would come after something like the Lodfafnismal, but probably didn't because it really breaks with the scene. But we have a similar runic mystical event that breaks with the scene in the Sigurdrifamal, which is a later text. So it's not uncharacteristic, I think, to break a scene to talk about the magic of runes. And that's exactly what they do. They go down a list of the different applications of runes. And in that list of applications, there are words that are already significant to the text because we've seen them in the Lodfafnismal. And then after that, let's see, that's the Runetal. Then we have the Lodatal. And the Lodatal are the final chapters. And they are written not in the Lodahatter formula, but they are written in the Galdrolog formula. So, Galdrolog. These are spell songs. And they say, hey, these are spell songs if you know how to use them. Now, that being said, the Lodfafnismal, I teased that I would display the significance. Between the Runetal and the Lodfafnismal, we have references to the theological mechanism that makes runes work. And so this is what's important about runes, is they are not just regarded as a writing system. And we all know, like, there's a cosmological story in the Runetal of how Odin found the runes, right? He hung on the tree and looked down and screamed and pulled up the runes. And we've all attached ourselves to one or more of the symbolisms of that and recognize that this is a sort of a magical and a very initiatory way of receiving something that's not characteristic of a typical alphabet. Especially when every other culture that regards their alphabet as coming from a divine origin, or Futhark in this instance, of coming from a divine origin, there's almost always direct theological action on the part of the people who believe that, using and regarding that alphabet. And the Lodfafnismal, Lodfafnir, has come upon the scene of the writing of his own fate. He's at the Well of Erd, and in Havamal 111, he describes it very musically, or rather, the whole scene is set forth. And to me, Havamal 111 is a very important song in my work. So the N111, he says, now I speak from the Thuler's chair, at the Well of Erd. I sat and I heard, I sat and was silent. I heard the speech of the High One, of runes I heard speech. And so, right there, they're teasing runes, and it seems like really important just from that. But what's really gets lost is the cosmological significance of the Well of Erd. Not as so much as a place of the Norns. I think we often, yes, that's why everyone's there. But there's also a council there, and so the council they're called the Ginregen, and we hear about them in the Voluspa, we hear about them in the Runetal. You will find runes in decided staves, very large staves, very strong staves, which the mighty Thuler colored, and the Ginregen have made, and wristed by Hropter of the Regen. So the Runetal, we see that that the Ginregen have a function in the creation or the administration of the runes. And I think this would be an administrative function, because we see in the Lodatal that they're at the Well of Erd, where the Ginregen meet. And then there are tablets of runes there. These are the tablets of fate. So whenever someone is born, the Norns gather and they decree the fate to the child. Early was the age when eagles screamed, holy waters fell from heaven's falls. Then Helgi, the strong of mind, was born by Bjorghild in Braulander. Night was falling in the dwelling. Norns came, they who the Odlingers ages shaped. Then they bade him become the most renowned chieftain, and be thought the best king. And so we can see that Helgi's entire saga is preceded by a visit from the Norns at the moment of his birth. The weaving of fate doesn't stop after birth. This is the initial orlog, or destiny, of an individual that is set out at this time. But also, as the gods make decrees about the order of the universe and of the world, various other things end up getting decreed. And this is precisely what happens in a saga called Gautric's Saga, where the character of Starkad actually gets to witness his fate. This is a very similar event to what is presently happening in the Lodfafnismal. In the event, Starkad sees Odin and Thor debating about what kind of blessings or problems he should have in his life. And so Thor believes that because Starkad's mother, Alfhild, favored a giant to himself, that he should be without children, and that he should commit crimes, and that he should be grievously wounded. And for each of these things, Odin gives him another boon, saying that he should live for 3 lifespans, saying that he should have the best weapons and clothing, that he should have vast sums of money despite being without lands, and that he should win victory in every battle, even though he's wounded. Also, Odin gives him the art of poetry, and so on and so forth. Odin is actually, in this saga, um, Odin Odin is sort of in the form of Starkad's foster father. So this is one of these ways in which Odin sort of becomes a mortal individual. And so we actually see um, in the saga itself that there are 12 seats that are in this council, and there's one empty seat. And Starkad is brought to this council by his foster father. But as the council begins, the foster father goes and takes his seat in the 12th chair, and is greeted by everyone as Odin. And so this is one of these really interesting transcendental moments where we see the the function of the Parliament of the Gods, because this Parliament is occurring at the Well of Erd, and we're witnessing again exactly the same thing in the Lodfafnir Mall. And almost, in these examples, we always see Odin presiding. So in the Voluspa, they would refer to the presiding deity as Gunheilagod, which is most holy God. In the Gunreg and Ol, on the judgment seats, the most holy God, and of that responsibility to give names to night and evening, what morning is called in midday, afternoon and evening, and to account for years. And then the other 12 would be the Ginregen, which means great judges. And so this is where Lodfafnir is. And he's been brought here by Odin. We don't have the story around that. But he's not the first hero to have been given this boon by Odin to go see the tabulation of his fate. And usually when these happen, you get to see the gods either advocating or disavowing the person based on what you would call, I guess, what you could consider a person's spiritual affinity for a deity. And you see this with a lot of modern pagans, where they'll say they have a spiritual affinity for a particular deity. So at the beginning of each section, they're using the terms of the Lodfafnir Mall. They're saying, read the Lodfafnir. That's how it says in some of the translations. Which they mean to say, read thee, they mean to say, basically take this advice. Write this advice into yourself. It's sort of, like, internalize this advice. But the real word is, real phrase there is Rathumk der Lodfafnir, which is, the Rathumk is to literally read. To Rath is to read, as in to read words, to read runes. And because he's at the Well of Erd, and we know that the Norns risk the runes as the gods make their edicts, then we know that what's happening is he's being read the Tablets of Fate. And then there's a combination of things happening in the text. He's receiving axioms worthy of a Havamal, because the Lodfafnir Mall is probably the Havamal of another text. So where am I at here? The Lodfafnir Mall. Why is it important? It's important because it shows the theology of where fate comes from, and it shows that it's intrinsically tied to runes. And so, as a result, but it's tied to runes in a way that's not the same, I think, as people conceive of runes as singular symbols, whereas instead it shows that the runes, as they pertain to fate, are more written out as complex thoughts and ideas, or complex events that are to happen. But the runes as symbols and shapes are also not confined to just simple shapes and simple words and simple meanings. Each rune symbol does have a complex system of ideas that we find in the rune poems, but we also find in the Gesta thought that are in the earlier portions of the Havamal. And there you'll see verses like, wake up early if you wish to take a man's cattle, his wealth, or his life, or something like that. And in there, they use fe for fehu from the runes, and they alliterate it with fjord, life, and they juxtapose it to ar, which is early, which is also synonymous with ar, the harvest. And so what they're doing is, and also the word man they use is madr, and in the manuscript they use the symbol madr instead of the word madr. So what you're looking at there is a combination of runes, 3 runes, ar, madr, fe, which is also fjord, because in this instance, wealth is life. And they actually lay that out in the Havamal, that a man is not devoid of wealth so long as he has his life. And then they go on to talk about relative wealth and relative fortune. So the Havamal actually does also, the Gestathot, or the regular normal portions, do also show sometimes the way you can unpack a symbol. Because, and with that, if the symbols can hide just in the axioms, just in the tropes of philosophy in their own day, then the symbols can hide anywhere. The symbols themselves of the runes are mimetic, which means they come from the mimir, right? They come from memory. They are memes, right? Each rune contains philosophical processes. It contains natural processes that have been described in the poetry. They contain all of these things that have a metaphorical relationship with each other. So when you evoke one, you are evoking the chain of metaphors. And so via the chain of metaphors and the mythology, you actually can really have a staggering amount of information in the Poetic Eddas concerning runes. The runes have the vast potential to encode large amounts of information. And this is not confined to Old Norse text. There are runic metaphors that get used even in Latin translation in the Gesta Danorum, and there are runic metaphors that get encoded into the Latin education of monastic texts. And in fact, there are brilliant Anglo-Saxon theological poems of a Christian nature that use the runes to make complex commentaries of Eusebius and other Christian theologians, using the same precedent set forth in the rune poems and in the old supposed pagan sources. So I would say that there's a method of discourse completely missing from the entire mythological record, and until we unlock that method of discourse, any sort of religious reconstruction, any sort of academic understanding of the materials, a complete understanding of the materials, can't be had.